Hello and welcome to my talk on quasi-naturalism and the problem of alternative normative concepts. So here is the problem of alternative normative concepts as it was developed by Matti Eklund in his book Choosing Normative Concepts. The following scenario seems possible. A community uses concepts that have the same normative role as our normative concepts, that is, roughly speaking, the same role in guiding individual actions and interpersonal criticism and advice, and yet these concepts refer to something else than our concepts. Eklund called this scenario alternative, and here's more exactly how he describes it. While their words good, right, and ought are associated with the same normative roles as our words good, right, and ought, their words aren't coextensive with our good, right, and ought. So even if they are exactly right about what is good and right and what ought to be done in their sense, and they seek to promote and to do what is good and right and what ought to be done in their sense, they do not seek to promote what is good and right and what ought to be done. Eklund argues that the apparent possibility of such a scenario poses a problem for any normative realist who aspires to vindicate the thought that reality itself favors our ways of valuing and acting, or as he puts it, for any ardent realist, because there seems to be an alarming symmetry between our normative concepts and the alternative ones. How can realists make good on the idea that our concepts are privileged by normative reality, given that anything they might say in support of the privileged status of our concepts can be mirrored by the imagined community as well? For instance, realists might claim that using our concepts is what we ought to do if we are to describe normative facts correctly. But members of the other community can truthfully say the same about their concepts using their own concept of ought. This challenge affects any realist view that allows for concepts with the same normative role in different extensions, including, for instance, Cornell-style naturalist views committed to a causal theory of reference, analytic naturalist views like Frank Jackson's analytic descriptivism, but also non-naturalist versions of realism insofar as they posit mechanisms of reference determination that have little to do with normative role. Here's how Eklund describes the choice facing any realist who accepts the possibility of alternative normative concepts. Such realists, he says, must either accept that there are ineffable questions about normativity, or else accept that the importance of normative questions is deflated. So the first option is to claim that even if each community is using its own normative concepts correctly, there is a further question about which concepts are better or privileged by normative reality, the answer to which will favor our concepts. However, Eklund argues, realists will have to concede that this further question cannot be adequately articulated, let alone settled, using our normative concepts, or any other set of normative concepts for that matter. In other words, it is an ineffable question. Alternatively, realists might be content to defend the privileged status of our normative concepts using those very concepts, and deny that there's any further challenge that they need to address here. For instance, they might claim that members of the alternative community do and say things that are objectively wrong in our sense of wrong, and that this is sufficient for a defense of realism in the face of alternative type scenarios. But this option does not seem to properly vindicate ardent realism either, given that, again, similar arguments will be available to users of the alternative concepts as well. We are still left without a clear case for the idea that reality itself favors our ways of valuing and acting, and disfavors other ways of using normative concepts. Now, here is what Eklund thinks is the most promising option for ardent realists in the face of this challenge: to argue that cases like alternative cannot arise, because concepts that have the same normative role must have the same reference as well. Eklund labels this thesis referential normativity. But the task here needs to be made a bit more precise. This is because alternative type scenarios only pose a problem for normative realism when they involve certain concepts, like the moral wrong or the all things considered ought. No realist should be troubled by scenarios in which, say, etiquette concepts have the same normative role but different extensions for different communities, given that such concepts are not plausibly amenable to a realist treatment in the first place. For this reason, Eklund restricts his challenge to thin normative concepts, but as Tristram McPherson has pointed out, the relevant divide here is arguably not between thin and thick concepts, but rather between concepts that are authoritatively normative and those that are not. So this is how I will understand the task of a view that aims to address Eklund's challenge by defending referential normativity. To rule out the possibility of alternative authoritatively normative concepts while allowing that the reference of other normative concepts can vary across different contexts of use. Now let me introduce normative quasi-naturalism, a view that I believe can vindicate referential normativity and avoid in this way Eklund's challenge. This view has three main ingredients. First, expressivism about normative discourse. This is broadly speaking the view that normative claims express desire-like mental states, like plans or attitudes of approval and disapproval. Secondly, there's a deflationary account of certain metaphysical and semantic notions in terms of which realism is usually stated, like truth, fact, or description. And finally, a naturalist metaphysics of normativity, on which normative properties are identical with, or at least fully reducible to, objective natural properties. Now I'll say more about each of these pieces and explain how they fit together. First, as I said, expressivism is, generally speaking, the view that normative claims express desire-like mental states, but I will rely on a more specific version of expressivism, namely a hybrid view on which normative claims express both desire-like mental states and representational beliefs. Among other virtues, this kind of view is well placed to account for the metaphysical claims of naturalism. First, let me introduce a simple version of the view to explain how this view is compatible with naturalism. So on this view, an atomic normative sentence like cheating on your taxes is wrong expresses an attitude of disapproval of actions that have a certain natural property and the belief that cheating on your taxes has that natural property. Here is how this view is compatible with naturalist realism about normativity. First, deflationism about truth and other related notions allows expressivists to endorse many tenets of realism. For instance, on a deflationary account, it is true that P is simply equivalent to P, and this equivalence schema fully captures the meaning of the word true. So expressivists can hold that it is true that genocide is wrong, taking this to simply rehearse the normative judgment that genocide is wrong. And similarly, expressivists can claim that there are normative facts, or that normative judgments describe such facts, by relying on deflationary accounts of these notions. Moreover, expressivists can endorse claims about objective normative truths and facts by taking such claims to express a particular kind of attitude. For instance, the claim that it is an objective fact that genocide is wrong might express, in part, an attitude of disapproval of actions that have a certain natural property, even with respect to scenarios in which we or others did not disapprove of such actions. And finally, hybrid expressivism can make sense of metaphysical naturalist claims like moral wrongness is identical with failing to maximize utility. This claim might express, for instance, an attitude of disapproval of actions that have a certain natural property, and the belief that that property is identical with failing to maximize utility. Now, I have used this simple view to explain how hybrid expressivism is compatible with naturalism, but ultimately I believe quasi-naturalists should rely on a more complicated version of hybrid expressivism if they are to properly address Eklund's challenge. Here's why. First, we need to distinguish between conceptual and referential normativity. Conceptual normativity means that sameness of normative role entails sameness of concepts. Referential normativity means that sameness of normative role entails sameness of reference. Now, if a view delivered conceptual normativity, this might seem to be enough to avoid Eklund's challenge. And the simple version of hybrid expressivism that I've just introduced would seem to uphold conceptual normativity. If the concept wrong as used by us and by the other community encodes the same desired-like mental state, which is correlated with certain behavioral dispositions that constitute the normative role of wrong, then we and the other community use the same concept of wrongness. However, this doesn't yet properly address the challenge, because even if different communities use the same concepts in virtue of using concepts with the same normative role, it still seems possible that the reference of those concepts varies between both communities. Indeed, this is precisely what we should expect for some normative concepts, and this shouldn't trouble us. As I said before, a good answer to Eklund's challenge should aim to vindicate referential normativity for authoritatively normative concepts like the moral wrong, while allowing that other normative concepts like etiquette concepts can have different extensions for different communities. This is why I believe quasi-naturalists should rely on a more sophisticated version of hybrid expressivism, like for instance Michael Ridge's view, which is embedded in a broader contextualist semantics for deontic and evaluative terms. More specifically, Ridge relies on a Kratzer-style contextualist model, on which two parameters determine the semantic content of terms like ought and good in particular contexts of use. First, a modal base, that is, a set of worlds in which certain background conditions are met, and secondly, an ordering source, that ranks worlds in the modal base, for instance by how well they satisfy certain standards. Here is an example of how this works. You ought to give a large part of your income to charity will be true in any context of utterance, just in case you give a large part of your income to charity is true in all the worlds in the modal base that are highly ranked according to the ordering source. And the ordering source in each context will depend on the flavor of the given deontic or evaluative claim. So in some contexts it might consist in norms of etiquette, while in another context worlds will be ranked in accordance with British common law, and so on. Now, on Ridge's view, authoritatively normative claims are a special subset of uses of deontic and evaluative terms, for which the ordering source consists in acceptable standards of practical reasoning. So, for example, you ought to give a large part of your income to charity, when used in this authoritatively normative sense, means that any acceptable standard of practical reasoning would recommend that you give a large part of your income to charity. And it's very important to note that this contextualist semantics does not entail relativism about normativity. In particular, a normative realist can adopt this semantic model and claim that the ordering source in these authoritatively normative contexts of use consists in objectively acceptable standards of practical reasoning, or some similar objective parameter, such that when we make authoritatively normative claims, we are talking about what we really ought to do, or what is objectively wrong, and so on. Ridge also wants to make good on realist ideas about genuine normativity and objectivity, but in an expressivist framework. So he proposes an expressivist account of the notion of acceptable standards. To judge that a standard is acceptable is to endorse a normative perspective that does not rule out that standard, where normative perspectives are understood as non-cognitive practical stances. On this view, to use the same example again, the claim that you ought to give a large part of your income to charity, if used in an authoritatively normative sense, will express a normative perspective and the belief that giving a large part of your income to charity is highly ranked by any acceptable standard of practical reasoning. Here is now how a quasi-naturalist view that relies on this version of expressivism can address Eklund's challenge. Both authoritatively normative concepts and other kinds of normative concepts like etiquette predicates exhibit conceptual normativity on this view, but only the former are also referentially normative. To start with non-authoritatively normative concepts, take the case of etiquette again. If we're talking about what kind of actions are polite, for instance, the semantic analysis here will be purely descriptive. It will talk about what is highly ranked by certain socially accepted standards of behavior, without also involving an attitude of endorsement of those standards, at least not as part of the meaning of etiquette claims. But claims about what social norms prescribe also have a practical role in guiding our actions and shaping interpersonal criticism, at least for the typical concept user, and this normative role will be roughly the same across different contexts of use. So etiquette concepts are conceptually normative. If two communities use certain etiquette concepts that have the same normative role, then both concepts are identical. On the other hand, both standards of etiquette will vary between communities, and therefore the reference of etiquette terms will vary as well. So for non-authoritatively normative concepts like etiquette predicates, we can have conceptual normativity without referential normativity. For authoritatively normative concepts, in contrast, not only does conceptual normativity hold true, but also referential normativity. Again, conceptual normativity is easily secured by expressivism. Take the claim that you ought to give a large part of your income to charity. The quasi-naturalist will argue that whether this claim is uttered by us or by the people in the alternative scenario, it expresses in part a normative perspective, which plays a direct role in guiding individual deliberation and interpersonal criticism and advice. So the same concept is expressed by ought in both communities in virtue of its shared attitudinal content that is constitutively linked with the normative role of ought. Quasi-naturalism also helps vindicate referential normativity for authoritatively normative concepts by allowing us to treat questions about the reference of terms like ought and wrong as internal normative questions, to which normative inquiry can establish unique objective answers, that is, answers that hold true no matter how those concepts are used by some community or other. For instance, the question, what is the reference of wrong for us and for the community in alternative, will be understood as equivalent to what kind of actions are wrong for us and in the alternative scenario. And to answer such questions, we need to engage in moral inquiry and identify the natural features that make actions wrong in these various scenarios. And again, expressivists have the resources to claim that the same natural features make actions wrong in all these scenarios, no matter how any community uses the term wrong. In other words, expressivists can claim that wrong has a unique objective reference. This has been my talk on quasi-naturalism and the problem of alternative normative concepts. Thanks for watching.